Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
And you can see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about African American art and the way labor history is really integral to understanding African American art. And some of these things are true of any art history course, but the labor issues are especially important for this subject. And I'm going to talk about 3 different conceptual ways to think about labor history in relationship to art. The first is the way that legal frameworks affect visual culture production. The second is, it matters who pays you. So the issue of patronage is really important in terms of subject matter and style in African American art. And then it matters who you labor for. And I'll use some examples of artists who, chose to work for African American audiences and the effect that that had on their work. So, speaking of law matters, the course starts in Africa because it's really important to understand the foundations of African American life in North America. And I started with this map from around 1700, which was documenting the different language and cultural groups in Africa. And this was because European missionaries at that time really wanted to evangelize. I mean, the slave trade is already underway, but the earliest kinds of interactions in sub-Saharan Africa really were related to Europeans who were trying to evangelize. They needed to translate the Bible into these different languages. And so we see this very detailed map of all these different cultures. When we get deep into the period of the slave trade, you can see that this same area is now divided up by commodities. So grain is a commodity, gold is a commodity, slaves, you can see here at the bottom, grain coast, gold coast, slave coast, that all of these are ways of dividing up this area and its resources for commodification during colonization. And I would like to point out that one of the reasons that the Europeans were dividing up the map in this way was also because they knew that people had very particular skills as laborers. So you look at this advertisement from Charleston, South Carolina from the 1780s, they're advertising that to be sold on board the ship Vance Island on Tuesday, the 6th of May next at Ashley Ferry. Choice cargo, 250 fine, healthy Negroes, just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. And what's important there is that South Carolina is chiefly a rice economy. And so they are very much aware of the skills and intellectual resources that Africans have that they exploit and capitalize upon. So I like to get rid of the idea at the beginning that Africans only are bringing bodily power to the Americas. They're bringing very sophisticated knowledge of grain production, of metalwork, of clay, and that these skills are really valuable. So I know we go through a bunch of history. I should point out that African American art is a G10 U.S. history as well as a straight art history. So the course is really sort of half and half. But to lay the groundwork for understanding visual culture production among enslaved peoples, it's very important to understand that the demographics are really different. They relate to economies, and they create really different conditions in the colonial era and the antebellum period as well. So in 1790, when the first census was taken, the population of South Carolina was listed as 44% Black, of whom only 2%, 1,801, are recognized as free, and more than 107,000 are enslaved. That creates conditions of brutal cruelty and repression. If you think about what does it take for 56% of a population to keep 44% of a population living in conditions of enslavement in which the value of their labor they are completely alienated from the value of their labor, to use a sort of Marxian perspective. And then I'm also just going to show you one case study from Massachusetts, which clearly has a very different situation. At Massachusetts, made slavery illegal in its first constitution. But even at that period of time, slavery was legal in Massachusetts until it became a state. But at that time, only 1.5% of the population was identified as Black, and there's no real large-scale agriculture in that area. So again, that's going to create really different conditions for visual culture production. In Massachusetts, the first legalization of slavery that happened in the colonies was in 1641, and these were the kind of Puritan ministers in the theocracy that they had set up in the colony of Massachusetts, and they passed a law legalizing slavery. There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars. And there they are referring to Native Americans, with whom they are at war pretty much constantly, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And again, this is a very kind of hypocritical way of deeming that if people are already enslaved when they come into Massachusetts colony, then, then that deed is already done. And they shall have the liberties and Christian usages which the laws of God established in Israel concerning such persons doth morally require. And what that meant was that it was the duty of evangelical Christians to not only save the souls of any person, but in order to do that, they had to be able to read the Bible. And so in Massachusetts, African Americans learned to read, whether they are free or enslaved. And I don't have time to go into it right now, but this quote, this text from Cotton Mather's essay in 1706 is basically saying that this is the best thing you could possibly do for your own chances of being saved in heaven, is to convert Negroes who have pagan religions and are clearly going to burn in the fires of hell. So into that framework of Massachusetts, in which a man like Prince Dima, who was the first known African-American painter in North America, he is enslaved from childhood, and is the only enslaved person in the household of Richard and Christian Barnes. Not only did he learn to write at that time, but they actually took him to London for training as an artist because he seemed to have a really great skill. And what I impress upon students is that he's still completely alienated from his labor. And you might think, oh, isn't that nice of the Barneses to, give him all his training to make a beautiful portrait like this work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But in fact, that they are just doubling the value of their own property, because portrait painting was a highly valued skill in Boston in the 1770s. So some of the evidence that we have for his cultural production comes from advertisement appearing in the Boston Newsletter, which I have quoted here. Negro artist at Mr. McLean's watchmaker near the townhouse. The Negro man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London who takes faces at the lowest rates. And there he was basically able to compete favorably with portrait painters who were much more expensive. The reason I use Prince Dima, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art website, they will reference Prince Dima Barnes as the artist, because this is actually signed on the back, Prince Dima Barnes. But at the time of the Revolutionary War, Prince Dima registered to fight on behalf of the Sons of Liberty, and he dropped Barnes. And I always honor the choices that newly liberated people make as far as naming themselves. So I refer to him as Prince Dima. But this is a good example of visual culture production in the North. And I might note, I say to my students when we go into the American wing, can you point out the African-American art, right? Look around this room full of colonial era portraits and tell me which one was made by the African-American artist. And they're basically indistinguishable, because there are so few African-Americans in Massachusetts at this time. There really isn't an opportunity for African inheritances in terms of visual culture production to be visible in the work. So this is a very traditional oil on canvas. The size is not especially large because he's going for a market that is a, less costly market. But the other sort of attributes of this gentleman, and actually he's a textile merchant, which is great to talk about with FIT students because he's wearing a hand-painted chintz robe sitting in Boston. This is imported from India. He's from Scotland, and it's a great example of that sort of global trade in commodities and in the global flow of people. So I want to contrast that with what happens in the South. And in the South, the beginnings of race-based slavery happen in the Virginia General Assembly in 1705, when they ruled all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resists his master and shall happen to be killed, the master shall be free from all punishment. And all the southern colonies followed Virginia in adopting these codes. And the reason this is the beginning of race-based slavery is because before this period of time, nation states generally had ruled, and I should say religious authorities like the Pope generally had ruled that you could only enslave people who were a different religion than you were. So Christians could enslave Muslims, Muslims could enslave Christians, and that sort of thing. But now we have slavery that is literally based on putting together all these people who had been enslaved in the colonies, African Americans, people of mixed inheritance, and Native Americans, and creating this new kind of category for who could be enslaved. This real estate, with that designation legally, enslaved individuals had no legal right to enter into contracts such as marriage or any kind of maternal or paternal benefits. The children born to a person designated as real estate belong to the bondholder. This is different than in the North, where people don't become property. I'm not saying it's okay in any way. I would love to point that out. But it is very different that people still in the North can testify at trials and that sort of thing. In the South, human beings literally are reduced to this legal status of a plot of earth. And that helps to underscore the barbaric cruelty of the slave system, particularly barbaric and cruel slave system in the South. But enslaved people had no legal right to the product or benefit of their labor whatsoever. And as a result of these brutal conditions, there were hundreds of rebellions that happened. And because of that, in 1739, the most famous of those was Stoner's Rebellion, in which about, I think, 20 European Americans were killed before that uprising was put down. And so they passed a law the next year, whereas the having slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be intended with great inconveniences, be it enacted that all and every persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as a scribe in any matter of writing whatsoever, hereafter taught to write, every such person or persons shall, for every such offense, forfeit the sum of 100 pounds current money. It's a lot of money. And so basically what's happening here is that people are trying to contain the potential for uprisings by preventing people from learning how to write so that they can't communicate between different plantations or, wherever people are, that they might be coming together to say, all right, it's this Saturday at 5 o'clock. Right? So into that context, we have the amazing story of David Drake, sometimes called Dave the Potter, who in the antebellum era made enormous jugs using a type of production called alkaline glazed stoneware, which was invented in South Carolina, which has fantastic clay deposits. But Dave not only signed his jars that he produced, but he wrote little poems on them. So this one says, this jar is to Mr. Siegler, who built the bar in Arnsburg, for Mr. Edwards, a gentleman who formerly kept Mr. Thomas Bacon's horses. And he was basically always taking advantage of the opportunity to assert his literacy, even in this environment in which it was very dangerous for people to know that an enslaved African American had the ability to write. And so he's not only expressing his own creativity, and a lot of these are very enigmatic and wonderful to try to figure out. He's also displaying a lot of courage in signing and creating these poems on his pots. I would also point out that he took the name after the Civil War, Drake, and that was the first person who had held him in bondage who was an evangelical Christian. And so the thinking is that this evangelical Christian taught the enslaved people who were working for him how to write, again, as part of evangelizing to them. And later on, he had also worked for a man named Lewis Miles, but chose to take the name Drake, again, as an adult after the Civil War. Just another example of one we have fun figuring out in class, good for lard or holding fresh meat. Blessed we were when Peter saw the folded sheet. So clearly there's a reference here to the New Testament, and David kind of leaves a lot of open-ended thoughts on his jars. So that is, the last thing I wanted to point out in this section is just that this legal framework for labor in the South in the antebellum era means that we have a lot of work to do to figure out actually works clearly produced by African Americans, but not attributed to them, that are attributed to the people who held them in bondage. And one of those artisans who's emerging from new scholarship is Peter Lee from Alabama, who was written about at the time as being a phenomenal woodworker. And scholars are really trying to piece together the work that he produced for the furniture company that he labored for. So second piece that I wanted to talk about, oops, I'm missing colon there. All right, so that it matters who pays you, and patronage is always something that we talk about. The person who buys the work is always influential in terms of what subjects are portrayed and the style in which they're portrayed, and I think you'll see that's especially true for African American artists. So Baltimore, Maryland, around 1810, there are 25,000 people who are listed as free. Oops, sorry. I don't know what just happened there. Okay. So this is wherever there are a lot of Quakers, there are a lot of free blacks, because Quakers were really the first denomination to decide that one could not remain a member of Quaker meeting and hold people in bondage. So this is true in Baltimore, it's true in Philadelphia, and a lot of other mid-Atlantic areas. So this is the work of Joshua Johnson, who used to be thought of as the first African-American oil painter until the work of Prince Dima surfaced, and that was really in the last 10 years. And again, Joshua Johnson is an artist that if we walked around the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I said, find the work of the African-American artist in the rooms full of antebellum portraits, you really couldn't pick them out that well. Most of his patrons were white families, and he became especially known for these really charming pictures of children of the upper middle class in Baltimore. And these are very kind of typical attributes of childhood. They're often shown domesticating small animals as a symbol of their discipline, of their being kind of brought up correctly. They're also shown with elements of wealth, such as these lace collars, the gold necklace, cherries, which would have been a fruit that wealthy women cultivated in their gardens. And then what Joshua Johnson always adds is this very decorative and brilliant use of color. He loves this sort of orangey red, and so that's one way his work is pretty distinguishable. I just noticed that the faces, people usually notice that faces of family members at this period of time look alike, and that was one of the jobs of the portrait artist at this time, was to demonstrate lineage. I always say this is like the who's your daddy kind of issue. So the children are, no matter what they actually look like, they're going to be made to look more like dad and definitely like each other. So here's another portrait by Joshua Johnson of Adelia Ellender, and we see again the cherries and those beautiful red shoes. But we also have two works of art by Joshua Johnson that he made of African Americans. And in this case, this is probably Daniel Coker, who was the most influential African American in Baltimore at the turn of the 19th century. He was a minister of the very new African Methodist Episcopalian Church. Actually, he had helped to found that church in Baltimore, and also a proponent of repatriation to Africa. So he ends up returning to Africa in the newly created country, if you call it that, of Liberia. And so I go through the whole sort of history of that. And I like to point out that even when Joshua Johnson is depicting, African Americans at this period of time, he really doesn't have any connection to African visual tradition. And so the style of the work is going to remain that European American style of oil on canvas in a square, rectangular, or circular mode. And the access that he had to education and to the work that he could see at that time is going to be, extremely, much more influential than any other kind of, tradition. So on another example of an artist who had to think a lot about, painting for clients, very particular clients, is Palmer Hayden in the Harlem Renaissance. And at this period of time, there were a lot of philanthropists who really wanted to support African American artists, but they had this very particular type of representation that they were comfortable with. And one was the sort of the humble, passive African American artist who, struggles against poor pay and not being able to sell work. And that's sort of what Palmer Hayden is serving up in this self-portrait with his family. And he actually was a janitor to make a living. Most of the artists in the Harlem Renaissance had other jobs that were working class jobs. And, the white patrons were extremely comfortable with this kind of African American artist. He also painted a lot of images of Harlem that were bought by white patrons, which depicted this kind of like happy scene, even though this seems to be somewhat chaotic and overcrowded. Maybe we might notice that the garbage needs to be picked up or whatever, but he was painting what people were buying, and this became a topic of much discussion in the Harlem Renaissance in terms of representation and the way that if artists wanted to sell work, there really wasn't much of an African-American market for painting, so they were sort of forced to make work that fit European-American conceptions. So finally, I wanted to just end with some artists who start to really break out of these kinds of labor traps, you might say. And hello, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the 19th century, a real kind of amazing breakout artist is the photographer James Presley Ball. And he's from Cincinnati. And he started out actually on the East Coast and moved west, as a lot of people were doing in the antebellum period of time. He learned to make daguerreotypes in Boston from an African-American daguerreotypist, and then opened a great daguerrean gallery of the West in Cincinnati. Cincinnati is on the border between free and slave states, so it's really at the heart of the conversations that are happening in the years leading up to the Civil War, the very contentious and difficult and horrible conversations. So what he did in his gallery very specifically was to integrate the artists who were shown there. So he was showing the work of African-American painters and photographers, and also integrate the patrons. So there's a wonderful website at the Cincinnati Museum of Art showing all of the different portrait photographs that he made. Of course, you may recognize Frederick Douglass at the top left, but there's an equalizing effect of his having posed his African American and European sitters in the same manner, using the same costumes, the same props. And then he makes this enormous mammoth pictorial tour of the United States that he started circulating around the country in 1855, and it doesn't survive, but the pamphlet that went along with it survived. And it's sometimes a little bit hard to convey how, what life was like before movies and, slideshows and that sort of thing. This was an enormous painted canvas that would be unrolled from one side of the stage to the other during the course of the presentation, and there would be music playing, and sometimes there would be scripts that were read. So this is the first abolitionist version of this kind of painted spectacular event, and it comprised views of the African slave trade of northern southern cities, cotton and sugar plantations, and J.P. Ball has plenty of access to people who have self-liberated to freedom in Ohio and who are telling their stories. And when we look at this, we can see that he is using his labor and the labor of African-American artists for this very political purpose of changing the repressive conditions of enslavement. The last group of artists I have are all artists who worked for themselves. So Harriet Powers is a quilt maker, and there's a lot of Africanisms in her work, and we use that term Africanisms to describe African cultural inheritance. So we see at the top right is an example of Dahomey applique, and you can see the same kinds of qualities of abstraction and the same technique of cutting out these forms and sewing them onto a background in Harriet Powers' work. And in general, African Americans living in segregated areas like the South retain more of these Africanisms, and when they make work for themselves and for their own communities, those Africanisms are expressed much more broadly. So again, it matters who you labor for. And this is Harriet Powers' amazing pictorial quilt, which is very much her own view. It's not, what she thinks the European American person wants to see. It's her own worldview, combining the New Testament and meteorological events, the moon and stars and so forth. And so we get a real insight into her creativity and the power of religion in her life, and this very kind of syncretic religion that is common in the South. And contemporary visionary artists, sometimes called outsider artists, used to be called folk artists, are Joe Minter. This is newly installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His work, 400 Years of Free Labor. Joe Minter was basically, grew up in the real shadow of slavery and into a sharecropping family, and was gathering up the kind of remains of slavery that were all around him and creating these absolutely enormous sculptural works. And the last slide I have of the beautiful dynamic quilt making of G's Bend. And I think that it's wonderful to put these works in the context. If you look at it, they are absolutely free form, creative, dynamic expressions that break every kind of rule that you would ever get if you were to buy a European American book about how to make a quilt, in terms of, symmetry or the pairing of colors. There's so much strong contrast here. And that these women made these quilts for themselves and for their families. They're now, of course, worth a fortune and shown in museums like the Whitney all the time. But it's a really great example of creativity, like sort of literally unshackled, And of course, it's fun to teach this at FIT where people really appreciate it. So that is my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy.
You're welcome.
So you can click that arrow so that you will disappear, Amy, like your screen will stop.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to do that right now.
Yeah, and then we'll come to the person who is speaking most, which is me now. Anyhow,
Okay.
yeah, so all of us can save some questions, and then I will start my presentation by sharing my PowerPoint, and then we can have some Q&A afterwards. Sounds good. Amy's presentation was really remarkable. I learned a lot.
Oh.
And then my period is a bit after, after 1860s. That's what the major immigration starts for Asian countries. So let me share my screen, the entire screen share. And then now, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So in my case, I am teaching Asian American art and design. Actually, briefly, I will show you my the blackboard that I am teaching. So Asian American art and design is a new class, just like Amy's. So we talk about a group of immigrants as well as like diasporic Asians. There is a little bit difference in their immigration status. But anyhow, so we start roughly from the 19th century, and then we move along, and then it ends 1990s, and then more like a contemporary period. So I would showcase what kind of labor and business issues that we come across during the class. So when you start this class, Asian American art and design, we talk about mass immigration, and then a lot of immigration laws, Chinese Exclusion Act, those kind of laws that the U.S. created in the second half of the 19th century. And then, do you hear this noise?
Yes.
Is it me or? Oh, so maybe I don't know who that is.
What is it? Is someone have construction outside of their house?
I'm going to mute myself because there is some construction back here.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's loud enough for you to hear, but I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. So this is Chinatown, 19th century. So this is sort of a beginning of mass immigration, from China, and there are some Chinatowns developing in major cities such as Honolulu, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And basically, a lot of Asian immigrants came as laborers, so that they didn't have a lot of choices. And also their residential environment is quite limited because a lot of people in California, they didn't want to rent their houses to immigrants. So as you can see here, from just houses to embroidered silk clothing styles, diverse artists from the beginning of the 1850s. But what's interesting is 1850s, Chinese immigrants were mainly living in Chinatown, and then doing a little bit of retail among themselves. But the other, like the younger and more able workers, were working in the Midwest for railroad constructions and mines and other heavy-duty laborers. Labor industry. And there is no schooling for them, and then there are not much legal protection either, and then they were often accused of ruining, the community spirit and other things, and also they are not allowed to bring their family members. So all these conditions become important. So this is not a photograph by a Chinese photographer. It's by American photographer who took Chinatown right before the 1906 earthquake. So in the development of our story, that this earthquake actually created an opportunity for Chinese immigrants, because they are going to claim that they lost their paperwork so that they can really support their residential status. so that some families actually willingly adopted other people's children, so that you have no photograph left, you don't have any paperwork left, but suddenly you have 5 kids as opposed to 2 of your own. So this was actually an opportunity. Sometimes it works better in certain ways. So we don't have actually many photographs of Chinatown before the earthquake, and this is one of those, like rare photographs. So city was quite ruined. And then, so this became an opportunity to rebuild like Chinatown and sort of reinstate certain relationship between, Californians and Americans. So we don't have a lot of great, how can I say, we don't have a lot of artworks to teach from the late 19th century. So, for example, this kind of photograph, as you can see, we don't know who the sitter is. We say portrait of a young man, and then the photographer was Kai Suk. We know it from the document. So as you can see here, Kai Suk ran a pretty lucrative business running a photo studio. Like a portrait photographs are always valuable. The sitter is actually has his own like a Qing Dynasty ethnic robe, shoes, and head is a little bit modernized, but he keeps his traditional garments, and then he's seated by the side. So here the issue is who the audience of this photograph is. Obviously, Kaisar is not going to sell this photograph to residents in San Francisco. It's actually custom ordered for the sitter himself. So for which occasion is he going to use this? We discussed this a lot in the classroom, and this is actually going to be sent home to his family, saying that he's okay, he's doing well, right? He's settling well, and then potentially it's going to be used as his what is it? Like a picture bride kind of thing, like it's going to be used for his arranged marriage. So there is a potential man working in San Francisco or somewhere in in the United States, and the family members will show this photograph and say, "Would you like to recommend your daughter to get married to my son or something?" So the size is very small. Do you see cut to the size? It's like a business card size. So size matters. It's small, and you probably save it a little bit, and then have it made and sent it. So the people who cannot work in intense labor industry, then they would find a sort of a small business for themselves, right? The main clients are Chinese immigrants themselves, and they usually operate their business in Chinatown. So that's why we end up talking a lot about Chinatown, like what kind of businesses that you often see in Chinatown, and mainly it's like a groceries, restaurants, and some like a more like a clothing alteration shop, for example, right? There are always clothing sellers for ethnic community, all of these. And then we also have a major photographer named Lai Yong. And if you don't see the photographer's name, actually you don't recognize whether it's a work by Asian Americans or not. And this is the portrait of Adolf Sutro. It's a painted portrait. So who was Adolf Sutro? He was a San Francisco mayor in 1890s. So obviously this painter moved up in a social ladder, and he was interested to have a photograph made for this mayors. He followed that American portrait type of a cameo format. Anyhow, some artists were quite successful, but as a scholar, we don't have a lot of information on this type of photographer. I mean, not photographer, painter Lai Yong. That's a little bit limiting conditions. So now, if we move to around the 1900, we are going to see some professional artists per se. So this work is made by Toshio Aoki. And this is actually a thunder god. This motif of a ferocious man, like a hybrid man, beating on the drums. He usually has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 drums around him. So it represents the thunder god, the loud noise that comes with. It usually pairs with the wind god. So the iconography comes from the traditional Japanese work, Buddhist art. This one, he used the mineral pigments on watercolor board. This is what we read in exhibition catalog, that this means he used the traditional Japanese color pigments, usually based on mineral sources. A lot of Japanese artists, not a lot, but these kind of Kushio Aoki type of Japanese artists are working in this mood of Orientalism or Japonism that was very popular in the 19th century. So we talk a little bit more about who Kushio Aoki was. So as you can see, it's interesting, he arrived in San Francisco in the 1880s to work as a commercial artist for a department store. So what does that mean? And in the late 19th century, color wood glasses were very popular to create a little bit elaborate advertising materials. So Japanese artists who are good at this type of graphic work with thick outlines, they were hired as commercial artists. And then eventually he became quite renowned for his decorative art. People invite him to decorate their houses, or he sometimes works to create background for the opera, butterfly kind of thing, operatic productions. So it is interesting to see that there is overlap between his own creation and also commercial art aspects. This type of double career is common for many successful Asian American artists. It is hard to maintain a list just like that in art. And I don't know whether you recognize this artist, but this is actually a monumental painting. Do you see the size 107 by 69 inches? I mean, this is something that I have to explain to students and point out, because personally, I myself have never seen work by Chiura Obata in person. It's hard for me even to conceptualize or deliver that vivid impression of his work, because I've never seen this. I've seen Lux Wow or other artists' work, but never seen this that scale. So I point out it's really monumental, large work. And the artist Chiura Obata is a very prominent artist. He lived long. I will show you his, like the first years a little bit later, but he's extremely talented. When he arrived in the U.S., he actually had a little bit of a training as a Japanese traditional painter, and then he developed his skills further. But he mainly painted landscape painting. So this is the Sacramento Valley, when the sun sets, right? And then he also painted high Sierra, Sierra Nevada mountains. So if you watch some documentaries at PBS, like American Master Series or something, you actually have a episode on Chiura Obata. And he was very involved with other American painters who went out to the national parks and painted the national parks. He was in a part of those movements. So that was the 1920s and 30s. Again, this painting is really monumental, but stylistically, it's a little more subjective use of colors, right? A little bit expressionistic. So he's away from the Japanese style of landscape painting. He adapted what is popular at the time in American art world, but materials are still traditional Japanese. This is painted on silk. So silk painting is hard. You need like a special training for it. And so he uses advantages of his own background and also adapted a new mode of presentation. But look at his like a birth date and death date. He lived really long, right? He lived almost 90 years old. So he went through a lot. The climax of his career is 1920s and 30s, and he often recognized as a very important painter of his generation. But when he was young, as you can see on the second bullet point, he worked mainly as an illustrator and commercial decorator. A lot of artists from Asia, they worked as illustrator or decorator. But he had major exhibitions. And then, as you can see, he also designed the set for the San Francisco press production Madame Butterfly. And I suppose it's relatively lucrative as opposed to paint for the commission or paint and not sell anything. And then what's interesting is his career during the Second World War. What do you expect he went through in the Second World War? He went to the internment camp. And while he was living in internment camp, he again went more art school. So he taught local artists and also local children, and then people in the internment camp. So after he came out of the internment camp, he went back to his painting career. So it's a remarkable individual. So we talk a lot about this aspect of living or livelihood as an artist. And Shiura Obata's son is Kyo Obata. I don't know whether you've heard of Kyo Obata, but he's a prominent architect living in St. Louis, Missouri. And Kyo Obata was also around 20 years old when the Second World War started. But Kyo Obata was lucky enough to avoid internment. His friends living in St. Louis, in the middle of the U.S., they actually helped him get a season or like a get by until the internment period is over. But Shiura Obata suffered very much. So we talk a lot about these interesting hybrid careers. And another really important artist among Asian Americans is Yasuo Kuniyoshi. Sometimes Yasuo Kuniyoshi is included in American Art Survey. And as you can see his painting, he actually lived in Washington State, northern side of Seattle. So he grew up on the farm. This is a farmland, right? The title is Cows in Pasture, 1923. It's 20 by 30 inches. So it's not a monumental work, but it's a decent size. And landscape in a way, or maybe trunk painting. But what is remarkable in this work is the style, right? He recognized that he intentionally made houses and cows seen from one angle, not from the other, right? He avoids that three-dimensional illusionism in a very deliberate way. So as you can imagine, he was quite influenced by Cubism at the time. So that's why Yasuo Kuniyoshi is sometimes mentioned in American Art Survey. He's one of the pioneers who adopted the Cubist style, 1920s. So Marcus Chagall, right? I and the Village. He talks a lot about his childhood. It's related, or depiction of houses. It's like a Pablo Picasso, the Cubist style. So we talk about adoption of new style. So how is he capable of introducing new avant-garde European style into his landscape painting? He went to art school. So people like Yasuo Kuniyoshi now shows different data of Asian immigrants. They are allowed, sometimes they are allowed to go to school, attend the school. So he saved money, he moved to San Francisco, he went to school, and eventually Yasuo Kuniyoshi moved to East Coast and worked in New York City, and he was teaching at Art Students League. Eventually he went to Paris. He went through a lot, but this is Yasuo Kuniyoshi. It's a self-portrait as a photographer, 1924. So obviously you have to, again, make a living while you are pursuing your dream as an artist. So he took jobs or, had a freelance, not a freelancing, what can I say, like a small project. But then eventually he moved to San Francisco, to New York City. And I didn't include his biography page. I skipped it, but he got Guggenheim Fellowship. So back 1930s, Guggenheim Fellowship was a great opportunity for many emerging artists to visit Europe. And then, but he also has to go to the internment camp, right? He died around the 1960s, or like 1967 or 69. So what did he do during the internment camp period? He didn't want to go to internment camp. He was living in New York City, right? So he worked for the U.S. Army. He was part of that intelligence like a unit. So he created anti-war or anti-Japan posters, propaganda posters. So that's how he was not able to go to the command camp. And then he was actually included in many abstract American art, like a new American art exhibitions in 1950s. But he created a lot of controversy because conservative politicians considered him not American enough. So you have this whole, I mean, so we studied Yasuo Kuniyoshi in 1920s as a pioneer of avant-garde art, but then we studied his career again in 1950s, along with the post-war American art, you know, going abroad, and you know the treatment of him or you know consideration of him as not quite American because he never changed his name. His name is Yasuo Kuniyoshi. He could have changed his name. A lot of Chinese artists did, but he still maintained his name, Yasuo Kuniyoshi. He signed his name in alphabet, you know, some corner. And eventually, when he was in Paris, he adopted. He painted a lot of these decadent, acrobatic dancers, and you know, cafe, maids. And the subject matter is not what harmonious or blissful. It's a little decadent, right? So anyhow, he came across a lot of difficulties in his life. Now, if you come to around the 1950s, I talk a lot about this artist named Song Moy. So what he is creating is sort of a color field or you know monochromatic painting style. So this is actually one of the large wall paintings that he creates for a building. But he actually has another interesting twist in his life. So he was actually living all the way to 2013, right? Somebody told me that they, you know, like they knew him while he was alive. I mean, I didn't know that he was living in New York City back then. But anyhow, he was a student of Hans Hofmann. Hans Hofmann is from Germany, right? And then we talk a lot about him as a pioneer of the monochrome painting in the U.S. He studied color theory. But if you look at his career, he was a war photographer. So during the Second World War, he participated in the Second World War. He was a photographer. And then he also got Guggenheim Fellowship. And then after working with Hans Hofmann, he created something like a Chinese classical motif combined with abstract expressionism. So he had a creative side, but mainly what was he doing? He was working as a printmaker. And as you can see, Stanley William Hayter's graphic arts workshop, Atelier 17. So he moved to New York in 1940. And then, you know, he participated in this graphic arts workshop, and he was very skillful. So he probably collaborated on a lot of avant-garde artists' print albums, like Marc Chagall, Robert Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, Mark Roscoe, you know, Willem de Kooning, like all these people were sort of related to the graphic arts workshop. So you either go to art school or you work at a major graphic art studios so that you meet leading artists of your own time. So this is the kind of work that he created using the Chinese calligraphy, but it's color woodcut, so it has very graphic features. And abstract, I mean, if you don't read the Chinese characters, it doesn't mean anything. Like it just looks like or some black sculptural designs. So we talk about these duality of their careers. You have one group in fine arts, the other group in this commercial art world. And when it comes to commercial art, Dan Kingman, he was a cinematic artist. Mainly is known for his watercolor painting. And again, you know, if you see the summary, he arrived in Oakland, California, and then changed his name. And then usually they go back to Hong Kong or what is it, Guangzhou, or their hometown in their teens. You know why? Because again, the legitimate schooling is not quite allowed. So instead of staying in the U.S., they usually go back and then finish their school, and then they come as a young man. So they have like a both cultural exposures. So he was working in the Department of State in 1950s, and then 50s and 60s. Dan Kingman worked as an illustrator in the film industry. That was a very major role. And then eventually he was recognized for his service. So, for example, his work is like this. Chinatown, San Francisco, he painted around 1950. So he had marvelous skills as a watercolor artist. But this one he created as a sort of a independent artwork, not as part of cinematic background. Or he also created this South Street Bridge, 1965. So these kind of careers, again show that like intersection between fine arts and commercial arts. So I didn't have enough time to put together my PowerPoint, but let me explain to you one more hybrid careers that you often see in an artist, especially in the U.S. That is, let me just go back to my presentation. When diversity council, sorry to make you wait. Right. I did an interesting presentation about George Gray Barnard, but well, it's not here. So hold on. Where is my George Gray Barnard? I think it's here. Oh, this is just one slide. Okay. Well, sorry. Where is my event? Well, let's skip that. I didn't have, but the reason I got into this artist with a diverse career is because of this man named George Gray Barnard, and he is a sculptor in the late 19th and early 20th century. But the way I know him is that he is the original founder of the Cloisters Museum. Have you been to the Cloisters Museum, like up in the Washington Heights or on the northern Manhattan? So George Gray Barnard was living in France in the early 20th century, and again he had to make his living. So he became an antique art dealer. So he collected a number of medieval sculptures from the monasteries or from the churches, because if you go to the countryside, a lot of small monasteries, they didn't have enough funding to maintain their foundation. So he bought a lot at a very cheap price, especially in Bordeaux or the countryside. And then, but he is known for this one is at the map. Actually, you can see it in a beautiful Tiffany wing, struggle of the two natures in man, and then the famous sculpture of Abraham Lincoln. But the way I know is when I study collectors of medieval art, George Gray Barnard sent numerous letters to Rockefeller Jr. to ask him more money in order to sell the entire collection of his for more and more money. And if you read those letters, it really shows how sort of pathetic and so sad to make a living as an artist. he sold his first collection of French medieval sculpture to Rockefeller Jr., and then that's how Rockefeller built the Cloisters Museum around 1914. And then George Gray Barnard had a second collection, and his second collection became actually foundation of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So you actually see his collections in two different places. You know, when I was reading George Gray Barnard's life, I was thinking, you know, you have to work so hard to become an independent artist. So when he was a young man, when he was in his 20s, you know how was he making living? He was a taxidermy artist. So he was stuffing animals for I guess natural history museums or for certain historical societies. And you know, but no matter what, he wanted to pursue his career, and then he moved from one to another. But actually, so when I was young, you know, I was only like 26 when I studied George Gray Barnard, and I was thinking, you know, how strange that is. You have to work so hard to be a in New York City or wherever. But then after 20 some years, actually my friends were struggling like George Gray Barnard, right? So anyhow, this is one reason that I am very passionate about incorporating business and labor history to our own classes. And I mean, Asian American art, I didn't know a lot about their background or immigration laws and other social background. So as I know more, I also add little by little to my syllabus. For example, reading materials, as you can see, in the beginning I didn't have a lot, but now, you know, it is actually expanding. So, for example, to use Wang, he wrote many interesting essays on Asian American art. Actually, I am now communicating with him. I introduced myself out of blue. I read your books, and he actually wrote a monograph on Yasuo Kuniyoshi. You know, he is helping me to, you know, to get connected to other scholars. This is how I am teaching my class. So let me stop sharing my own screen, and then let me see. So now we can open up the floor for the conversation now. So how do I proceed? Any okay, comments or reflections? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fantastic the drill down that both of you took into your respective areas of interest. I've never even scratched the surface before.
To hear about your art history other than the one that we all learned. I was also to introduce you to someone who was my art history.
Oh, so in my class, we watched Tom Wood's presentation on Yasuo Kuniyoshi. There was a major retrospective American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. So we watched his videotape lecture together.
And he was,
really? Okay.
We're having trouble hearing when people talk in the room.
Oh, okay. So you have to speak up to the So Greta just said that she actually knows Tom Wood, a major curator and scholar on Yasuo Kuniyoshi. He taught at Bard College. So we were talking about Tom Wood. And Amy, do you have any comments?
Well, I just think it's interesting that there's so much overlap between the artists I was talking about and the artists you're talking about in terms of the importance of understanding who they're working for and what the, you know, legal framework is for their involvement in American production of any kind, and the way also that people get kind of shoehorned into certain kinds of labor based on these sort of stereotypes and assumptions about what they can do and what they can't do, and that these are not labor conditions of their own making. You know, with these groups of immigrants and people who are marginalized, oppressed in different ways, that they're constantly struggling against these frameworks that are legal, that are cultural, that are sometimes very long lasting. And it's definitely an added dimension that my students, or our students, I should say, kind of understand really well, because a lot of them as designers are grappling with similar kinds of, you know, strictures on what they can make given how much money they have or who they're working for, and, you know, how much freedom of expression they really have. So I thought that was really interesting that there was a lot of overlap.
I
I have a
agree.
question for
yeah.
Amy.
Yeah.
And my question is, I guess, Prince Denmark?
Yes.
Yeah. According to the slavery law at the time of the ownership, did he own his own labor, or did he,
No.
you know, paint portraits and then the money was given to, did his owner own his labor as well?
Absolutely. And that's the thing about Northern slavery. You could say that in some ways, or in many ways, it was less brutal. But in terms of the fact that an enslaved person had no legal right to the value of their labor, that's true in the South and in the North. There are also conventions whereby in the North, more people are actually able to save money and to buy their own freedom or buy the freedom of their loved ones, because the convention was to give people time to labor on their own to save up money. So that's much more true in the North than in the South. But again, that's not a legal requirement. The really sad thing about Prince Dima is that he finally, you know, he gets his freedom. Massachusetts outlaws slavery, and the Barnes family are loyalists, so they go off to England. And then he was fighting in the Revolutionary Army, which wasn't very common for African Americans because the British were guaranteeing freedom. But it was more common in Massachusetts because Massachusetts was also very clearly stating that it would, you know, end slavery. But he died, he got a cold and died. So he only had 1 year of freedom before he passed away. Yeah, so all the work that we have that we know was made by him was made in this period before the Revolutionary War when he takes up arms. So everything that we have is signed Prince Dima Barnes. But we know that when he, you know, was conscripted into the army, he signed his name as Prince Dima. So that's how we know that he made that choice.
But the fact that he signed his name, was it to sort of identify himself only, or I mean that to me has some sort of value. That's the fact.
Oh, absolutely, and it also had value to the Barnes because in that framework, they were doing a great credit to their own souls by converting an African American to be a good Christian, which meant in this Congregationalist church, you had to be able to read, you had to speak your vows in front of the congregation, you had to be able to read these vows out loud. So that's why literacy rates in New England in the colonial and antebellum era are the highest in the world, because this particular branch of Protestantism insists on literacy as an essential element to salvation. So again, that's where I don't like to let the students get into this trap of thinking, oh, those Barnes people, they were so nice, I taught him to read and got him trained to be an artist, but the whole value of that accrued to them and not to him. So it would have been much nicer for them to just free him and let him, keep the money that he earned.
Of course, we're dealing with a different society at the time.
Yeah, but in Massachusetts, many people were manumitting the people they held in bondage. So that was a very particular choice. In Massachusetts, again, only 1.5% of the population in 1790 is identified as Black in the census. So it's a completely different thing than in the South, where there were actually laws against manumitting enslaved people. And the instances where it happens is typically where a man is manumitting his own children, which is, yeah, like super gross and all that. But slavery is super gross.
What did you say about what did a man do to his own children?
Amy, Eileen was asking you a question, like what did men do to their children, like your last part?
Oh, manumitted meant to grant freedom. And so there, for example, like Alexander Hamilton, famously, everyone loves to talk about him. He was a member of the Manumission Society in New York, and that there were these societies in different northern cities that were promoting the idea that you know, slavery was bad, and so people should grant freedom to the people they held in bondage, which is called manumission. And it most typically happened when men were manumitting their own children. If you think about the family problems created by having the children of an enslaved woman, that in today's language we would just say that this is rape, because women don't have, enslaved women do not have the power of consent, right? But to have those children kept in the same place with the white wife and the white children, you know, often these manumissions happen again. You know, we don't have to think of it as, oh, isn't that so nice? Oftentimes it's, you know, happening because of these very uncomfortable situations that are just make men's lives easier to manumit their children.
So Ron, do you want to share your thoughts and reflections?
Are you talking to me? I'm sorry.
Bless you.
Can you hear me?
Ron, can you speak? It's your
Yeah.
turn.
I think I am speaking, but can you not hear me?
No, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. I just really would love to have both presentations. Is there a way that you could share those with us, or
Yes,
to become part of?
I am recording our whole presentation. So it's a video file will be available on our website, eventually the NEHFacultySeminar website. And also Amy and I probably can send you PowerPoint that we created. So you can take a look.
But we have a Blackboard shell, correct?
You were cut off. What did you say?
Is there?
We have a Blackboard shell for this.
Blackboard.
Just
Oh
put
yes,
them there.
yes. And then we can also upload on our Google Drive. Our Google Team Drive.
That's great.
Okay.
Fascinating. Thank you both. I enjoyed them very much.
Okay, so Dan is sick, so he doesn't want to talk, but let me introduce this fascinating exhibition that's coming up. So this is the Museum of the City of New York. Museum of the City of New York. Hold on, let me share my screen. Hold on. I was creating my syllabus for Art in New York this spring semester. So I was looking for a lot of exhibitions that are shown in the city. And do you now see my screen, Museum of the City of New York? And
Yeah.
here, if you go down, in the upcoming exhibitions, you see City of Workers and City of Struggle.
Yeah.
And I thought it's relevant to our, actually current discussion. It said how labor movement changed in New York. So it opens on May 1st. So if we all like to go, I can email the curator who organized the exhibition and say, can you give us like a guided tour? Or it's also nice to hear what their story is, right? What they came across. And these are railroad workers, labor movements, obviously, garment workers, and all kinds of labor movements. So this will be interesting. So, immigrants, women, people of color, and the unskilled, new waves of workers. We are going to eventually discuss these issues of new waves of workers later in our faculty seminar. So, so this is an interesting exhibition that we may consider visiting together, right? Like after the semester is over, we can go sometime in May. So that's one thing. And then, David Brody left, and the uni also disappeared. I think they have other work to do. So, we can conclude this meeting, now. I mean, we don't really have to go all the way to 2 hours. So, Amy and I will share this presentation on the Google Team Drive, as well as in our Blackboard shell. And then we are going to arrange another face-to-face meeting sometime in March. And then we also have to organize our upcoming freelancer symposium in April. So you will hear from me and Ben soon. There is no break. We have to work hard.
Okay. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Hold on. Eileen wants to say something.
Bye, Amy.
I just wanted to say I was fascinated with Dave's Grace, the potter who wrote the poems on the pot, and it led me to think about how people always find a way to communicate. And another way, of course, with this particular group was through music. Through all this, music is great communicator.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
So, let's leave the meeting room. And, see you next week at the convocation if you come to the to campus.
Yes, I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Ben. Bye.
Bye-bye.